Picture this, a narrow dirt trail cutting through dense rainforest in far north Queensland. The air is thick and wet, pressing down on three hikers like a warm, damp cloth. Insects are screaming from every direction. The canopy overhead is so thick that midday sunlight arrives in thin, broken shafts that barely reach the ground. It should be a perfect day for a walk. And then, from somewhere deep in the undergrowth, something begins to move. It does not sprint. It does not charge. It simply steps out onto the trail behind them, tilts its enormous blue head to one side, and begins to follow. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, unhurried, deliberate, like something that has decided a decision has been made, and there is absolutely no point in reconsidering it. The 3 hikers look back. They see the bird. They look at each other, and then, without a word being spoken between them, they start walking faster. The bird walks faster too. Over the next several hours, across 6 kilometers of some of the most demanding terrain in the country, that cassowary will not stop following them. Not once, not for a single moment. And the hikers, for reasons that will become very clear, cannot stop moving either. If you want to understand why that bird was so dangerous, why stopping was genuinely not an option, and what it is about the cassowary that makes it unlike almost anything else walking on land today, then stay with this. Because the full story is stranger and more fascinating than most people ever realize. And before we go any further, if you find yourself watching content about the moments when wild animals and human beings collide, and you want more of that, hit subscribe now. This is exactly the kind of story we live for. Now, let us start at the beginning, not just the beginning of that particular walk, but the real beginning. Because to understand what happened on that trail, you need to understand what a cassowary actually is. The cassowary is a bird. That sentence sounds simple until you stand next to one. Then it sounds like someone has made a fairly significant error in the classification of living things. A large adult southern cassowary stands between 1.5 and 1.8 meters tall. That is the height of a grown adult human being. It can weigh anywhere between 50 and 85 kilograms. The females, which are larger than the males, can push past that upper limit. They carry themselves with a posture that is less bird-like and more dinosaurian than almost any other living creature you are likely to encounter outside of a fossil record or a very ambitious film set. The body is covered in coarse, black, double-shafted feathers that hang like a heavy coat. They do not flutter in the wind. They do not look soft. They look like armor. The neck is long and vivid, bright blue running up from the chest, graduating to purple at the back, red wattles hanging down beneath the throat, like decorations on something ancient and ceremonial. The face is small and fixed, with an expression that conveys absolutely nothing. No fear, no aggression, no warmth. Just a kind of absolute, unwavering attention that is, in its own way, more unsettling than a snarl. And then there is the casque. Rising from the top of the cassowary's head is a tall, bony ridge called a casque. It is made of a keratin-covered structure, hard and prominent, and it can reach 15 to 18 centimeters in height on a fully mature bird. Nobody is entirely certain what it is for. There are several competing theories. It may help the cassowary push through dense undergrowth. It may play a role in sound amplification, since cassowaries communicate with low-frequency booming calls that travel far below the range of human hearing. It may be a display feature used in competition between individuals. It may serve multiple functions at once. What everybody agrees on is what it looks like. It looks like a weapon being worn on the head. It looks like something that belongs on a creature from an earlier, more violent version of Earth. Which brings us to the feet. Each foot has 3 toes. The inner toe carries a claw. That claw is a dagger. On a large adult cassowary, it can measure up to 12 centimeters in length. It is straight, rigid, and pointed with a precision that suggests it has not arrived at its current form by accident. The cassowary does not peck at threats the way most birds do. It kicks. The kick is delivered with both feet simultaneously, in a jumping downward strike, or with a single powerful forward thrust. The legs are heavily muscled, supported by a skeleton that evolved for power and speed over varied terrain. A cassowary can run at 50 kilometers per hour through dense forest. It can jump 1.5 meters into the air from a standing start. It can swim. It can wade. It can navigate slopes and root systems and muddy creek crossings that would have a human hiker moving at a crawl. The cassowary is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most physically formidable birds on Earth. And it has a documented history of using that physical capability on human beings when it decides to. There have been at least one confirmed human death attributed to a cassowary attack in modern times. In 1926, in Australia, a 16-year-old boy was killed when a cassowary he and his brother had encountered on their property knocked him down and struck him in the neck with its clawed foot. The wound severed a blood vessel. He died from the injury. Beyond that single confirmed fatality, there are hundreds of documented incidents of cassowary attacks on humans in Queensland alone, ranging from minor encounters where the bird simply charged and stopped, to serious injuries requiring hospitalization. The Queensland Government Wildlife Authority keeps records. Those records are not short documents. People who work with cassowaries in captivity, and there are relatively few of them for very good reasons, speak about the birds with a combination of deep respect and a very specific kind of wariness. They describe animals that are not aggressive for aggression's sake, but are absolutely unwilling to be challenged, surprised, cornered, or ignored. They describe a bird that processes its environment with great intelligence and makes decisions based on what it perceives as threats and opportunities. They describe something that has not evolved to fear the things that most animals fear, because for most of its evolutionary history, almost nothing in its environment presented a genuine threat to it. The cassowary's closest living relative is the emu. Further back, both share an ancestor with ostriches, rheas, kiwis, and the extinct moa. These are the ratites, the flightless birds that evolved on the ancient southern supercontinent of Gondwana and then spread as that landmass fragmented over millions of years. The cassowary's lineage in Australia and New Guinea stretches back through evolutionary time to a point when the continent was a different shape and supported a very different cast of characters. The cassowary evolved in a world of megafauna, of marsupial lions and giant predatory birds and crocodilians of enormous size. It survived all of that. It adapted, persisted, and continued, and it carries in its physical design the evidence of everything it had to survive to still be here. Today, in Australia, the southern cassowary is found almost exclusively in far north Queensland. Its range is restricted to the wet tropical rainforests of the Daintree, the Atherton tablelands, the Cardwell Range, and associated pockets of lowland and mid-altitude forest running between Cooktown and Townsville. This range is not as large as it once was. Habitat clearance, vehicle strike, dog attacks, and human encroachment have reduced cassowary numbers significantly. Current estimates suggest somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 southern cassowaries remain in Australia. Some researchers believe that number may be an overestimate. The species is listed as endangered under Australian federal environmental law. It is considered by ecologists to be one of the most important animals in its ecosystem, a keystone species upon which much of the wet tropical forest depends for its regeneration. The cassowary eats fruit, enormous quantities of it. A single bird may travel several kilometers each day through the forest, consuming the fallen fruit of more than 230 plant species over the course of a year. It swallows fruits whole, digests the flesh, and deposits the seeds elsewhere, sometimes kilometers away, in its droppings. For many rainforest plant species, the cassowary is the only dispersal agent large enough to swallow their fruits whole and carry their seeds far enough to matter. Without the cassowary, significant portions of the wet tropical rainforest's plant diversity would collapse over time, as large-seeded species failed to regenerate and spread. The forest needs the cassowary. The cassowary, in turn, needs the forest, and both of them exist in a very specific corridor of landscape in far north Queensland that is, by global standards, one of the most ecologically significant places on the planet. It is also, for anyone who wants to walk through it, an extraordinary destination. The three hikers arrived at the trail in the early morning. It was a well-known route, not maintained as a formal park track, but used regularly enough by locals and serious bushwalkers to be clearly visible on the ground. The trail ran through the lower edge of a cassowary habitat corridor, the kind of country where dense rainforest gives way briefly to more open ground, near a creek crossing, before closing in again. It was warm. It was humid. It was exactly the kind of place where you expect to see remarkable things, and so the three of them were paying attention to their surroundings, as any careful bushwalker in that country should be. The first indication that the cassowary was there came before they saw it. A sound, or rather the absence of the particular sounds the forest had been producing. Birds that had been calling in the middle canopy went quiet. A movement registered in peripheral vision, something large and unhurried, shifting between the trunks, at a distance of maybe 30 meters. And then it stepped out. The bird was a mature female, based on her size, Substantially heavier than the males of the species, she was carrying the full complement of cassowary presence. The blue and purple neck, the hanging wattles, the casque rising from her head, the black bulk of her body on legs that looked like they had been put together for a different, more industrial purpose. She stepped onto the trail maybe 15 meters behind the last of the three hikers, and she stopped. The hikers stopped too. The bird looked at them. There was no vocalization, no display, no obvious sign of aggression. She simply stood and looked, with the directness that cassowaries have, which is total and unwavering, and communicates nothing except that you are being assessed. The hikers had done enough research to know some basics. You do not run from a cassowary. You do not turn your back on one unnecessarily. You do not corner one. You do not approach one. You do not, under any circumstances, allow a cassowary to assess you as either a competitor or a resource. What you are supposed to do is move away slowly and give the animal space to do whatever it was doing before you interrupted it. So they began to move, slowly, carefully, keeping the bird in their sightline, moving up the trail in the direction they had been traveling. The cassowary moved with them. Not quickly, not threateningly, just steadily, maintaining the same distance, moving when they moved, pausing very briefly when they paused, but always resuming before they had stopped for more than a moment or two. The hikers tried stopping completely. They stood still on the trail, watching the bird, giving it the maximum amount of time and space to lose interest. The cassowary stood on the trail and watched them back. When they had been stationary for perhaps a minute and a half, she took 3 slow steps forward. Not aggressive steps, not hesitant steps. Just steps, as if the stationary hikers represented a problem she had identified a solution for and was now implementing. The hikers started walking again. What they were dealing with, without yet fully understanding it, was a cassowary that had learned something about human beings. Whether this particular bird had been previously fed by people, either deliberately or through the inadvertent habit of leaving food scraps on trails, whether she had simply had enough positive or neutral encounters with humans to lose her wariness of them, or whether something else entirely was driving her behavior, the outcome was the same. She had decided that these 3 people were interesting or useful, or at minimum not a reason to leave the trail, and she was following them. This is not an unprecedented situation in far north Queensland. Park rangers and wildlife managers in the region deal with habituated cassowaries with some regularity, birds that have lost the appropriate behavioral distance from human beings that keeps both the birds and the people safe. A habituated cassowary is not a tame cassowary. The habituation applies to proximity, not to temperament. A habituated cassowary that feels threatened, surprised, or challenged will respond the same way any cassowary responds, with the full physical toolkit it has been carrying for millions of years. The thing that made the hikers' situation complicated was the terrain. The trail they were walking was not a simple flat path with easy bailout options on either side. It moved through dense rainforest, where the undergrowth on both sides of the track was a tight, tangled wall of palms and ferns and fallen timber and buttressed root systems. Leaving the trail was not a casual option. Moving off-trail in that country means slow, difficult, noisy movement through vegetation that does not yield without effort. And a cassowary moves through exactly that kind of undergrowth faster and more efficiently than any human being alive. The trail itself was their best option for movement. And the trail was the cassowary's trail too. They had also started the walk later than planned, which meant the day was already warming toward its uncomfortable peak. Humidity in the wet tropics of far north Queensland on a warm day is not a minor inconvenience. It is a physical presence. It sits on the body and wraps itself around the lungs and turns every kilometer of walking into an energy transaction that costs more than the distance would suggest. 3 people moving continuously for hours through that country, unable to stop for more than a moment or two without the bird closing the distance, were spending energy at a rate that had a hard limit. They could not stay on the trail indefinitely. The trail had to take them somewhere, and so they kept moving. Over the course of the following hours, several things were attempted. At one point, the group stopped, and 2 of them moved off the trail into the undergrowth slightly, while the third stood visible, watching the bird, hoping she would simply pass them by on the trail and continue in whatever direction she had been going. The cassowary stopped and waited. She was patient, in a way that felt, to the 3 people watching her, almost strategic. When they came back out onto the trail, she resumed following. At another point, they tried making themselves larger, raising arms and walking sticks above their heads, not in a confrontational gesture, but simply increasing their visible size, which is a known deterrent for many animals. The cassowary was not deterred. She regarded them with the same fixed attention and maintained her distance. They tried moving faster. The cassowary moved faster too. They were not, it must be said, being chased in the way the word chase implies. She was not rushing at them, she was not displaying, she was not vocalizing, she was simply following, with a consistency and persistence that was, in its own way, more stressful than a direct charge would have been, because a direct charge has an endpoint. This had no apparent endpoint. The bird had simply decided that where they were going was where she was going. The territory question matters here. Cassowaries are territorial animals. Adults maintain home ranges that they defend against other cassowaries, particularly during the breeding season. A female cassowary's home range can cover several square kilometers of forest. She knows every part of it in the way that a person knows the rooms of the house they have lived in for decades. The hikers were moving through her country. Every section of trail they covered was ground she had walked before. Every creek crossing, every slope change, every gap in the canopy was known to her and unknown to them. There is something profoundly disorienting about being followed by an animal in its own environment. The power dynamic is not what instinct suggests. The animal following is not the prey. The animal moving faster is not the predator. The three hikers were guests in a space that belonged to the bird, and the bird was exercising something very like sovereignty over that space by simply remaining present within it. 6 kilometers in the wet tropical rainforest is not a Sunday stroll. The trail crossed a creek twice on stepping stones that required careful footing. It rose and fell through root-cross sections where the proper footfall had to be found before each step could be committed to. It passed through a section of palm scrub where the vegetation pressed close on both sides of the track, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Through all of it, the cassowary followed. And here is what is important to understand about those 6 kilometers. The hikers were not panicking. They were not running. They had made an early and correct decision to keep moving at a brisk but controlled pace, keep the bird in sight, avoid any sudden movements, and get themselves to the end of the trail where there was a road, a car, and an exit. That was the plan, and it was, ultimately, the right plan. But it required them to execute 6 kilometers of careful, continuous movement through demanding terrain in significant heat while monitoring an animal behind them that was capable of serious injury, and while not having the option to simply sit down and rest when they needed to. That last part is the part that the story is named for. They couldn't stop. Not because the cassowary would certainly have attacked them if they had. There is no way of knowing that. The bird's behavior throughout the encounter was not overtly aggressive. But the risk calculus was clear. A bird of that size, that physical capability, that close, that consistent in its pursuit, with motivations that could not be fully read, was not a situation where resting on the trail was a sensible choice. Every minute they stood still was a minute she potentially closed that distance further. Every time they had stopped, she had moved forward. The pattern was established, and they were not in a position to test its limits. They reached the end of the trail. They came out onto a firebreak track, wide and open, with a vehicle parked at the edge and the sounds of the human world filtering back in through the trees. They walked to the car. They looked back. The cassowary had emerged from the tree line and was standing at the edge of the forest, watching them go. She stood there for a long moment, still and composed, and then she turned and walked back into the trees. She was gone in seconds. The forest swallowed her. The 3 hikers got in the car and sat there for a while without speaking. What had just happened to them was not a dramatic predator attack. No one was injured. No claws were deployed. No charge was made. And yet what they had experienced was something that very few people encounter in the modern world, outside of genuinely wild places. They had spent hours in close proximity to an animal that outweighed them, could outrun them, could injure them severely, and had made a decision to be near them that they had no power to reverse or negotiate. They had been the less powerful party in a shared space. They had operated within the rules of someone else's environment, and they had done it correctly, and they were safe. But the memory of those 6 kilometers, the weight of the bird's presence, the specific quality of being followed by something like that, was not something that was going to leave them quickly. And that is the cassowary's particular power over the human imagination. It is not a predator in the way a lion or a crocodile is a predator. It does not hunt people. It does not stalk people for food. But it occupies a category of physical presence that overrides the comfortable assumptions that most people carry into natural spaces. The assumption that birds are small, The assumption that a feathered creature is a delicate thing. The assumption that size and danger come packaged together in obvious ways. The cassowary violates all of those assumptions simultaneously and replaces them with the much older, more honest recognition that some of the most ancient living designs on Earth have survived precisely because they are very, very difficult to threaten. Let us talk about what cassowaries actually do when they genuinely decide to engage with something they consider a threat. The forward kick is the primary weapon. The cassowary leans back slightly, draws both legs up, and drives forward with the feet, leading with the inner claw. The force generated by this movement, applied through a 12-centimeter spike at the end of a leg, driven by the musculature of an 80-kilogram bird, is not a glancing blow. The inner claw is capable of penetrating deeply into soft tissue. Attacks on humans that have been medically documented describe lacerations requiring surgical treatment, injuries to the abdomen, injuries to the legs, and in the worst cases, injuries to the neck and chest when a person has fallen or been knocked down. The bird does not stop after one strike. It continues to kick until the threat, as it perceives the threat, has resolved. Dogs in far north Queensland that encounter cassowaries are killed with some regularity. Large dogs, working dogs, animals with their own significant physical capability. The cassowary dispatches them with a speed and efficiency that observers consistently describe as shocking in its decisiveness. There is no prolonged struggle. There is an assessment, a decision, and an outcome. Cassowaries have also been documented attacking their own reflection in windows, attacking the painted image of a cassowary on a road sign, and attacking vehicles. The vehicle attacks are worth pausing on for a moment because they reveal something about the cassowary's psychology that is directly relevant to understanding the trail encounter described here. When a cassowary attacks a vehicle, it is typically because the vehicle has entered the bird's territory or perceived space, and the bird has decided to address the situation directly. The cassowary does not appear to consider the size differential between itself and a motor vehicle to be a reason not to engage. It makes its assessment based on different criteria than a size comparison. It makes the assessment based on whether the thing in front of it is behaving in a way that requires a response. If it is, the cassowary responds. This is not stupidity. It is a completely consistent behavioral system for an animal that evolved in an environment where there were very few things larger than itself, and almost none of them presented a threat that the cassowary could not address through direct engagement. Its threat-response calibration was set in a world where direct engagement almost always worked. The introduction of human beings and their vehicles and their buildings into that calibration has not fundamentally changed the settings. The cassowary still operates on the original system, and the original system is one that does not automatically back down from size, which makes the behavior of those three hikers, maintaining calm, keeping moving, avoiding direct challenge, giving the bird no cause to escalate, even more admirable in retrospect. They were operating correctly in a situation where the stakes of operating incorrectly were very high. They were doing the right things in the right order under sustained pressure over a significant distance. The management of cassowary encounters in Queensland is a topic that wildlife authorities take extremely seriously, and their guidance to visitors in cassowary country is comprehensive and consistent. Do not feed cassowaries. This is the most important rule, because fed cassowaries become habituated cassowaries, and habituated cassowaries are the birds most likely to cause serious injury. A bird that has associated humans with food will approach humans for food, and when the food is not forthcoming, the same physical directness it would apply to any other situation applies to the human standing before it. The number of cassowary-human negative encounters that can be traced back to an original feeding event is substantial. Beyond the no-feeding rule, secure your rubbish so cassowaries cannot access it. Drive slowly on roads through cassowary habitat, because vehicle strike is one of the leading causes of cassowary death in the wild. Keep dogs under control and away from cassowary habitat. If you encounter a cassowary in the wild, maintain distance. Move away calmly, do not corner it, and do not attempt to touch it or take close photographs that require you to approach it. That last point about photography is one that comes up repeatedly in the records of cassowary incidents. The impulse to get close to an extraordinary-looking animal for a better photograph has driven a significant number of people into situations they were not equipped to be in. The cassowary's visual impact, its extraordinary coloring and form, combined with the fact that it does not immediately flee when approached the way many wild animals do, creates a dangerous false confidence in people who have not yet understood what they are standing near. The cassowary does not flee because it has no particular reason to. It does not flee because it is not afraid. It stands its ground and looks at you because that is what it does. And if you interpret that as an invitation to approach, you have made a reading error that the bird may correct in ways you will not enjoy. Conservation of the cassowary in Queensland is a complicated and ongoing effort. The wet tropical rainforests it depends on are protected to a significant degree within national park boundaries, but the cassowary's home ranges often extend beyond park boundaries into private land, and the corridors between forest patches that allow cassowaries to move, find food, and find mates run through landscapes that are actively managed for human use. Road crossings, fence lines, agricultural clearing, and urban development all intersect with cassowary movement in ways that create ongoing risk for the birds. The Queensland government operates a cassowary conservation database and works with landholders, councils, and community organizations to maintain and restore habitat corridors. There are cassowary feeding territories that have been mapped and are monitored for bird health and behavior. When a cassowary becomes seriously habituated to humans or begins to display persistent aggressive behavior near populated areas, wildlife officers may attempt to relocate the bird, though relocation carries its own risks, as birds introduced to unfamiliar territory may struggle to establish themselves and may clash with resident birds already occupying that range. The recovery of cassowary populations from their current endangered status requires not just the preservation of existing forest, but the active restoration of degraded and fragmented habitat, the reconnection of isolated forest patches through revegetation corridors, the management of feral animals that compete with cassowaries for food or prey on their eggs and chicks, and the sustained reduction of vehicle strike through road management and community awareness. The cassowary also plays a role that extends well beyond its own population in the health of the forest ecosystem. When cassowary numbers decline in an area, the seed dispersal function they perform begins to fail. Large seeded plant species stop spreading. Their regeneration slows. The forest structure over time becomes less diverse, which affects every other species that depends on that diversity for food and shelter. The loss of the cassowary is not just the loss of one species. It is the beginning of a cascade of changes in one of the most ancient and complex forest systems on the planet. The wet tropical rainforests of far north Queensland are old in a way that challenges easy comprehension. The core of the wet tropics region is considered to be the oldest continuously surviving tropical rainforest on Earth. Parts of it trace an unbroken lineage back more than 100 million years, to a time before Australia had separated fully from Antarctica and New Guinea, when the entire region was part of a vast southern forest that covered a different world. The plant families found in those forests today include lineages that predate the flowering plant's great diversification, that carry in their genetics the record of an earlier version of the living world. The cassowary walked in those forests, or something ancestrally very close to it walked in those forests, for an enormous span of time. The relationship between the bird and the trees is not incidental. It is built into the biology of both. The trees make fruits of a size and composition that the cassowary can process. The cassowary makes dispersal journeys of a scale and pattern that the trees require. They have been shaping each other for so long that they carry each other's influence in their physical design. When you walk in that forest, when you hear the deep booming call of a cassowary at a frequency you feel more than hear, when you find a pile of seeds in a clearing and realize the bird has been through here recently, you are touching something with a depth of time behind it that is not easy to hold in mind. It is very old. It has survived things that ended other worlds. It is still here, and it is not fragile in the way we sometimes comfort ourselves by believing wild things are fragile. The cassowary and the forest it maintains are survivors of the deepest order, but they are under pressure. Real pressure, of the kind that does not resolve itself without intervention and sustained effort from the people who share their range. The 3 hikers who walked 6 kilometers through that pressure on a warm day, followed every step of the way by one of the most remarkable birds on Earth, came away with something that is difficult to put a precise value on. They came away with the specific knowledge of what it feels like to be in the physical presence of an animal that is older in its design than almost anything else sharing their continent, that is genuinely powerful, that is not afraid of them, and that chose, for its own reasons and on its own terms, to spend several hours in their company. That knowledge sits differently in the body than knowledge acquired from a screen or a page. It has a weight to it, a physical quality, the memory of the sound of her feet on the trail behind them, the specific muscle engagement of walking fast without running, the heat and the humidity, and the green and broken light of the forest, the the sustained alertness of knowing she was there and staying measured anyway. These are things they will carry for a very long time. There is a specific kind of respect that only comes from an encounter like that, not the respect that comes from a photograph or a wildlife documentary or a conservation statistic, though all of those things matter and all of them contribute to care. The respect that comes from having been followed for 6 kilometers by something magnificent and survived it well, not because the thing was overcome, but because the right decisions were made, and the forest, and the bird, and the 3 people in it all came through the day without damage. That is, when you think about it, exactly the outcome everyone should want. The cassowary is listed as endangered in Australia. It is found only in far north Queensland in any viable population. It requires specific forest conditions, specific fruit-bearing trees, specific corridor connectivity between habitat patches. It cannot adapt to a paddock the way a crow can. It cannot follow the human footprint into suburban parks and managed gardens. It needs the real thing, the deep, old, wet, complex forest that it helped build, and that built it in return over more time than we have names for. And it is worth protecting, not because it is harmless, or because it is safe to encounter, or because it fits neatly into a category of appealing wildlife. It is worth protecting because it is extraordinary, because it is a functioning piece of an ecosystem that has survived intact since before the continents reached their current positions. Because the forest it seeds and the seeds it carries